The reactor never runs out of fuel. That is the whole point of a nuclear carrier. A Nimitz-class ship carries enough enriched uranium to steam for over 20 years without refueling. No tanker alongside, no fuel barge, no supply dependency of that kind. The vessel is designed to be self-contained. Unlimited range, unlimited endurance. So here is the question that should not need asking. Why, on a carrier operating in the Persian Gulf right now, does a small team of engineers spend their watch obsessing over a pair of distillation units, checking temperatures, measuring output, logging flow rates as carefully as any reactor technician monitors a coolant loop? Why does the commanding officer of a billion-dollar warship receive a daily water production report the same way he receives an aircraft readiness report? The reactor keeps turning, the ship keeps moving, but the carrier's ability to stay on station, to keep launching FCA-18 Super Hornets off the bow, to keep the flight deck turning, to maintain operational tempo in one of the most contested stretches of ocean on Earth, quietly depends on the answer to a question that sounds almost mundane. How much fresh water did we make today? That question, and the engineering behind it, is what this video is about. Stay with it. Because the answer changes what naval power actually looks like from the inside. To understand why water becomes the binding constraint on a nuclear carrier, you have to understand what a Nimitz-class ship actually is. Not the headline version, the operational version. USS Nimitz herself was commissioned in 1975. The class runs 10 ships, the newest USS George H.W. Bush entered service in 2009. Each hull displaces roughly 100,000 tons fully loaded, length 1,092 feet, flight deck width 252 feet. The ship carries two Westinghouse A4W pressurized water reactors, each driving two shaft and propeller sets through steam turbines. Combined output, around 260,000 shaft horsepower. Top speed, in excess of 30 knots, classified at the exact figure. The air wing on a Nimitz-class carrier in a Gulf deployment typically includes around 64 to 72 aircraft. Strike fighters, FCJ-18C Hornets, and FCJ-18EF Super Hornets make up the core. Electronic attack comes from EA-18G Growlers. Airborne early warning from E-2D Advanced Hawkeyes. Logistics and search and rescue from MH-60S Seahawks. Fixed-wing carrier onboard delivery from C-2A Greyhounds, though some ships have transitioned to CMV-22B Ospreys. The entire air wing, working together, is what makes the carrier a strategic instrument rather than just a large vessel. That air wing launches from 4 C-13 steam catapults, 2 on the bow, 2 on the waist. Each C-13 catapult uses high-pressure steam to accelerate an aircraft from 0 to flying speed in roughly 2 seconds across roughly 300 feet of track. A fully loaded FC-8E Super Hornet weighs up to 66,000 pounds at max takeoff. The catapult absorbs that physics problem and solves it, shot after shot, for the duration of a deployment that can run 6 to 9 months. Here's what that means practically. Steam catapults consume steam. A lot of it. Each catapult shot draws from accumulators that must be recharged between launches. On a high-tempo day, say 60 aircraft movements, the catapult system draws on a steam supply that has to be managed, balanced, and replenished continuously. That steam comes from the reactor plant. And the reactor plant, to produce steam efficiently and safely, requires fresh water, not seawater. Fresh water, treated, demineralized, quality-controlled fresh water that will not corrode or foul the heat exchangers, the steam lines, the turbine blades, the secondary loops. There is no other source. The Persian Gulf does not provide fresh water. The Gulf is in fact one of the salty balls of water on Earth. Salinity runs around 40 parts per thousand compared to roughly 35 for average ocean seawater, driven by high evaporation rates and limited freshwater inflow from rivers. Bringing fresh water aboard from a supply ship every time the reactor or the catapults need it would be operationally absurd and tactically dangerous. It would tie the carrier to a supply schedule, creating predictable patterns that an adversary could exploit. So the carrier makes its own water, every day, at sea, from the Gulf itself. The system that does this is called the ship's distilling plant. On a Nimitz-class carrier, the primary distilling capability comes from multiple flash-type evaporator units, low-pressure distillation systems that take seawater, reduce the pressure until the water boils at a lower temperature than normal, flash it into steam, and then condense that steam into fresh water, leaving the salt and minerals behind in brine that is discharged back overboard. The process is thermally efficient because it uses waste heat from the engineering plant, heat that would otherwise be rejected anyway, rather than burning additional fuel to drive the evaporation. The numbers are not small. A Nimitz-class carrier's distilling plant is sized to produce several 100,000 gallons of fresh water per day. Official figures run around 400,000 gallons per day as a design target for the full plant operating normally. Some sources indicate peak capacity approaching 500,000 gallons per day under favorable conditions. For context, the U.S. Navy's standard fresh water allocation for a sailor at sea runs around 60 gallons per person per day, covering drinking, cooking, bathing, laundry, and sanitation. With a crew of roughly 5,000 sailors and officers aboard, the carrier, air wing, and ship's company combined, human consumption alone demands something in the range of 300,000 gallons daily. That leaves the remainder for technical use. Feed water for the reactor's secondary steam loops, water for the catapult accumulators, water for cooling systems, water for the ship's boilers, water for aircraft maintenance operations, water for the medical facility, water for the galley at the scale of a mid-sized hotel running 3 meal services simultaneously for 5,000 people. The margin between what the distilling plant produces and what the ship needs on a high-tempo operational day is narrower than most people would expect from a vessel of this size and cost. What is most surprising about this system is not its scale. It is how little redundancy the ship can afford to sacrifice before operational consequences become real. Here's what that looks like in practice. A Nimitz-class carrier's distilling plant is not a single unit. It is a collection of modules, individual evaporator stages, distributed across the engineering spaces. The redundancy is intentional. If one unit goes down for maintenance or repair, the others continue. The plant is designed so that no single failure causes a catastrophic shortfall. But partial degradation is not the same as catastrophic failure, and partial degradation is exactly what happens in a sustained Gulf deployment. The Persian Gulf's water is corrosive. High salinity, high temperature. Surface water temperatures in the Gulf in summer can reach 35 degrees Celsius, warmer than most tropical oceans, and biological fouling from microorganisms that thrive in warm, shallow water. These conditions accelerate wear on the evaporator internals, the tube bundles, the brine connections, the mist eliminators. A unit rated for a certain output in North Atlantic conditions will typically underperform those ratings in Gulf conditions. The engineering teams aboard know this. Their maintenance logs account for it, but knowing about the degradation does not stop it from happening. Here's the problem that does not appear in any press release about carrier power projection. A Gulf deployment, sustained at high operational tempo, creates a slow-motion maintenance problem inside the distilling plant that the crew is continuously managing against. Each evaporator unit that drops below peak efficiency shifts load onto the remaining units, which in turn experience higher stress and faster wear. The maintenance team is chasing the degradation curve even as they run the systems that are causing it. I went through the publicly available Navy engineering and maintenance doctrine on distilling plant operations, and one detail kept coming back. The standard guidance is explicit that freshwater production rates are a primary factor in determining whether a ship can sustain high operational tempo or must reduce it. This is not buried language. It is frontline operational planning criteria. The ship's engineers work through this via controlled shutdowns. Take one unit offline, clean and inspect it, restore performance, bring it back online, then rotate to the next. The maintenance cycle has to be coordinated with operational requirements. You do not take a distilling unit offline the day before a major strike package is planned, because you need every gallon the plant can produce to charge the catapult accumulators and top off the feedwater systems. The engineering officer and the operations officer are having conversations that look, from the outside, like logistics scheduling, but are actually about whether the air wing launches at full capacity or reduced capacity 48 hours from now. This is the first layer of the paradox. The reactor provides near unlimited propulsion energy. But the freshwater systems that the reactor's own steam loops depend on are a constrained, degradable, maintenance-intensive resource. The nuclear heart of the ship is, in some operational sense, held hostage to plumbing. Now layer in the threat environment, because the Persian Gulf in 2024 and 2025 is not a permissive operating area. It is contested in ways that directly affect how hard the carrier must work and therefore how fast its systems consume the resources, including water, that sustain operations. The Houthi campaign against shipping in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden, which escalated sharply in late 2023 and continued through 2024, forced significant repositioning of U.S. naval assets. Carrier strike groups that might otherwise have operated further from the strait found themselves maintaining closer presence to the region. USS Dwight D. Eisenhower's deployment in 2023 and 2024 became one of the most operationally intense carrier deployments in recent memory. The ships air-wing flew strike missions against Houthi targets in Yemen for months, a sustained combat operations tempo that had not been seen since the early years of Operation Enduring Freedom. Sustained combat operations tempo means sustained catapult cycles, FCA-18E and FCA-18F Super Hornets launching on strike packages, EA-18G Growlers flying electronic warfare support, E-2D Advanced Hawkeyes maintaining the airborne picture around the clock. Each launch cycle draws on the steam plant. Each high-tempo day pushes the distilling units harder. Meanwhile, the threat environment is shaped by actors who understand, at least implicitly, that American carrier power in the Gulf has logistical dimensions. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy operates a fleet of fast attack craft, small, fast, numerous, and designed for the shallow littoral environment of the Gulf, where a large carrier has limited maneuverability. The Urgshi fast boat strategy is not about sinking a carrier. That is not a realistic objective. It is about complicating the operating environment, forcing defensive expenditure, and potentially, in a more serious escalation scenario, targeting the supply and support vessels that provide the carrier with what the nuclear plant cannot: food, aviation fuel for the air wings aircraft, ordnance, and the personnel and spare parts that keep the maintenance cycle running. Put yourself in the engineering officer's position for a second. You are running a distilling plant that is slowly degrading in Gulf conditions. You are supporting an air wing flying at combat tempo. One of your evaporator units is showing efficiency numbers that say it needs maintenance. The strike schedule for the next 72 hours is packed, and somewhere in your supply pipeline, the next maintenance parts delivery is days away. Do you take the unit down now, reduce water production, and accept some operational constraint? Or do you keep running it degraded and hope the numbers do not get worse before the parts arrive? That is a real decision, made by real engineers on real deployments. It does not appear in the operational summaries, it shapes them. The economics here are worth making explicit because the asymmetry is remarkable. A Nimitz-class aircraft carrier costs, in current dollars, somewhere between $4 and $5 billion to construct. The Gerald R. Ford, the lead ship of the newer Ford class, came in at approximately $13 billion, including the developmental costs that will not repeat on subsequent hulls. Operating costs for a Nimitz-class run roughly $600 to $700 million per year when you include the air wing, the escort ships of the carrier strike group, and the shoreside support infrastructure. An individual evaporator tube bundle, one of the primary wear components in a flash-type distilling unit, costs on the order of tens of thousands of dollars. Replacement parts for the full distilling plant maintenance cycle for a deployment represent a budget line that is almost invisible against the carrier's total operating cost. We are talking about a cost differential of perhaps 4 to 5 orders of magnitude. The component that constrains the ship's operational capability costs roughly 0.001% of the ship's construction price. And yet, if that component is not maintained, if the distilling plant's output drops far enough below the ship's daily water requirement, the operational consequences scale directly and immediately. The first thing that gets rationed when water production drops is not reactor feed water. That has priority, because the reactor's cooling integrity is non-negotiable. The second priority is catapult system water, because the catapults are the reason the ship is there. What gets cut is crew allocation. The Navy has water conservation protocols that engage in stages as production falls. Shower schedules tighten. Laundry is restricted. The galley adjusts meal preparation methods. These measures can reduce crew consumption meaningfully, from 60 gallons per person per day toward 40, or even 30 under strict conservation, but they extract a cost in crew fatigue, morale, and the basic human sustainability of a long deployment in high heat. The Gulf in summer is brutal. Temperatures on the flight deck can exceed 50 degrees Celsius. A crew operating in those conditions on restricted water allocation is a crew that is working harder to maintain performance. The flight deck crew, the sailors in colored jerseys who move aircraft, hook up catapult bridles, handle fueling and ordnance, are doing physically demanding work in extreme heat. Their hydration status is an operational variable. A dehydrated aircraft handler makes errors. Errors on a carrier flight deck, where jet blast, spinning propellers, and ordnance are present simultaneously, have consequences measured in aircraft, in people, and in missions. Here is a take that will probably get some pushback. The US Navy has poured enormous investment into the offensive and defensive capabilities of its carrier strike groups, the SM-6 interceptors on the Arleigh-Burke-class destroyers, the advanced radar systems of the Aegis Combat System, the electronic warfare suites of the EA-18G Growler. While the logistical infrastructure that sustains the human beings who operate all of that, equipment has received comparatively less attention. The distilling plant on a Nimitz-class carrier is, in engineering terms, 1970s technology running inside a 21st century weapon system. The physics has not changed. Flash evaporation is still flash evaporation. What has changed is the operational demand placed on that system in a threat environment that did not exist when the Nimitz was commissioned. Here is where the layers start resolving, where the paradox closes partially and a new one opens, the Gerald R. Ford class was designed to address some of the Nimitz class's logistical constraints. The Ford uses electromagnetic aircraft launch system catapults, EELS, rather than steam catapults. This is one of the most significant engineering changes in American carrier aviation since the adoption of the angled flight deck in the 1950s. An EELS catapult uses a linear induction motor, driven by electricity from the ship's power plant, to accelerate the launch carriage. It does not use steam. It does not require the steam accumulators, the steam valves, the high-pressure piping, and the associated water consumption that the C-13 system demands. An EELS-equipped carrier removes one of the major technical water consumers from the equation. The carrier's fresh water production still needs to serve the reactor's secondary loops and the crew, but the catapult's direct water demand, which on a Nimitz-class ship running 60 sorties in a day is substantial, simply disappears. That is the resolution this whole setup has been pointing toward. EELS breaks the catapult water link. But here is the catch, and it matters. The Ford class's EELS system has had reliability problems, significant ones. The system requires an enormous electrical load to charge and fire. The ship generates enough power from its two A1B reactors, which are more powerful than the Nimitz's A4W reactors, but the power conditioning and storage systems needed to deliver that energy in the precise, rapid pulses the catapult demands have been technically challenging to engineer to the required reliability standard. Early in the Ford service history, EELS failures were frequent enough that the ship's available sortie rate was meaningfully affected. The Navy has worked through most of those problems. USS Gerald R. Ford deployed to the Mediterranean in 2022 and to the Red Sea in 2023 and 2024, and her operational performance has improved substantially. But the point stands. Eliminating the steam catapult's water dependency introduces a different constraint, electrical reliability and power management, that requires its own engineering discipline to manage. So the Nimitz-class ships, which will remain in service for years, USS Nimitz herself is scheduled for decommissioning in 2025, but several of her sisters will serve into the 2030s. Continue to carry the steam catapult water interdependency as a feature of their operational reality, and those ships are the ones on station in the Persian Gulf right now, running their distilling plants, logging their daily water production, making the calculus between catapult tempo and maintenance cycle on a daily basis. What does this look like from the commanding officer's level? The Carrier Strike Group commander, a rear admiral, receives daily operational summaries that include ship status reports. Those reports include, as a standard line item, freshwater production rate and reserve status. This is routine, but the routine existence of that data point in the daily brief tells you something. Water production is a variable that command considers when making operational decisions. The relevant decision matrix looks roughly like this. On any given day, the commander is weighing sortie rate requirements from theater command, which reflects the current threat picture and mission tasking, aircraft readiness rates, which depend on maintenance and parts availability, ordnance status, crew fatigue levels, and system status, which includes the distilling plant. If water production is at 95% of design capacity, there is margin. The ship can sustain high tempo. If it drops to 80%, one major evaporator unit degraded, running on the others, the margin tightens. The ship can still fly a full schedule, but the engineering officer is watching the reserve tanks and the feed water levels carefully. If a second unit drops out of service unexpectedly, the math changes fast. This is the scenario that produces what operators call a constrained operations day. Not a mission kill, not a crisis, a managed reduction. Sortie rate comes down from 60 launches to 45. The catapults run at a cadence that allows water systems to recover between cycles, the crew conservation protocols activate, and the ship remains on station and capable, just not at peak. Here is what this means strategically. The Houthi threat model, launching barrages of Shahed 136 type one-way attack drones and anti-ship ballistic missiles against shipping in the Red Sea, is designed to force sustained defensive expenditure from US and allied naval forces. Each Houthi drone costs somewhere in the range of 20,000 Zen to $50,000. Each SM-2 or SM-6 interceptor fired from an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer costs between $400,000 and $4 million. The arithmetic of that exchange favors the attacker, and the Houthis understand it. But the less obvious dimension is this: a sustained high-threat environment that forces the carrier to fly a high-tempo defensive and strike cycle also runs its distilling plant harder, accelerates wear on its evaporator units, and shortens the interval between required maintenance periods. The Houthi campaign does not have to damage a single American ship to impose operational costs on the carrier strike group. It only has to sustain the pressure that keeps the carrier working hard. One detail that stuck with me when looking at USS Dwight D. Eisenhower's deployment. The ship spent roughly 8 months at sea with only a brief port visit, operating at a pace that the crew described in later accounts as genuinely grueling. The Eisenhower's operational tempo in 2024 was cited as among the highest seen from an American carrier in decades. That tempo extracts costs from every system on the ship. The distilling plant is one of them. The numbers only tell part of the story. The human dimension matters too. 5,000 sailors and officers live and work on a Nimitz-class carrier during a Gulf deployment. The average age of the enlisted crew is around 20 years old. These are people who grew up in air conditioning, who have phones and social media, who are accustomed to the abundance of fresh water in American daily life, and who are now spending 6 to 9 months in one of the hottest maritime environments on Earth, doing physically demanding and often dangerous work in a space where fresh water is produced industrially and rationed when the machines that make it fall behind. The flight deck is where the physical reality is most acute. A flight deck during flight operations is a place of controlled violence. Jet blast at temperatures that can cause burns at close range, propeller arcs, catapult equipment under tension, arresting wires under load, aircraft taxiing in tight patterns around each other. The crew working there, the yellow jersey aircraft directors, the green jersey maintenance crews, the red jersey ordnance handlers, the blue jersey plane handlers, are working in heat that can reach dangerous levels. Hydration is not optional, it is an operational safety requirement. When water conservation protocols activate, the tension between crew welfare and operational tempo becomes concrete. The commanding officer can choose to cut the sortie rate, reduce the number of launches per day, to give the distilling plant time to recover reserves and allow the crew full water allocation. Or the commanding officer can maintain the sortie rate and tighten conservation protocols, accepting some crew welfare costs to sustain operational output. Both choices carry a price. Cut sorties and the theater commander notices. The carrier's contribution to the air tasking order shrinks. The strike packages get smaller. The deterrence function of the carrier, its ability to signal capability and willingness through visible operational tempo, diminishes somewhat. Maintain sorties under water stress, and the crew is working harder in worse conditions. Fatigue accumulates faster, and the risk of errors on the flight deck increases in ways that do not show up cleanly in any metric until something goes wrong. Most people assume that the commanding officer of a carrier has nearly unlimited flexibility, that the ship's enormous capability creates enormous options. The evidence tells a different story. The options are real, but they are tighter than the headline numbers suggest. And the tightness comes from mundane engineering constraints that the carrier's offensive capability, in all its sophistication, cannot override. Stepping back, what this tells us about how naval power actually works is that the gap between designed capability and sustained operational capability is filled, or not, by logistics. The carrier does not fail at the level of its weapons or its aircraft or its reactors. If there is a degradation in what the ship can deliver, it emerges from the sum of 1,000 small maintenance battles, of which the distilling plant is one. The Nimitz-class was designed to sustain operations in high-threat environments over long periods, and it does. But it does so through continuous, intensive human effort against the entropy of the operating environment. Not automatically, not passively. The Ford-class's EELS catapults remove one piece of the water dependency puzzle. The A-1B reactors provide more electrical power, enabling better support for future systems. The Ford-class's other design improvements, a redesigned flight deck that increases sortie generation rate, improved elevators, a smaller crew by roughly 500 people relative to the Nimitz-class, address several of the logistical stress points that Nimitz-class operators manage daily. But the Ford-class is not fully deployed to the Gulf on a routine basis yet. The ships that are there, doing the work, are Nimitz-class hulls, and for those ships, the daily water report remains what it has always been. A quiet measure of how much operational capability the engineering team has been able to sustain against the physics of the Persian Gulf. Will the Navy fully transition its carrier force to EELS before the Nimitz-class hulls retire? Comment yes or no. It is a closer question than most people realize, given the pace of Ford-class production and the current decommissioning schedule. Here is the final layer, the one that brings the paradox full circle. The Strait of Hormuz is 33 miles wide at its narrowest point. Through it flows approximately 21 million barrels of oil per day, roughly 20% of global petroleum consumption, representing close to $2 billion of crude every 24 hours. The carrier strike group in the Persian Gulf exists, in substantial part, to ensure that strait stays open, that the tankers can move, that the oil flows, that the global economy does not receive the shock of a Hormuz closure. The carrier's deterrent function requires that it be visible, capable, and credible. Credibility is a function of operational tempo. Operational tempo is a function of how many sorties the air wing is flying, how capable the ship's weapons systems are, how well trained and ready the crew is. All of those things trace back, somewhere in the chain, to the ship's ability to produce and manage fresh water. A Nimitz-class carrier in the Gulf is, in one framing, the most powerful conventional military instrument that has ever existed. In another framing, it is a city of 5,000 people floating in a saltwater desert, making its own drinking water every day through industrial evaporation, carefully managing that water across competing demands to stay at the operational tempo that justifies the entire deployment. The reactor runs, the catapults fire, the FCA-18 Super Hornets launch, and somewhere below the waterline, the distilling plant runs its quiet, continuous, unglamorous cycle, boiling the Gulf's salt water, condensing the steam, measuring the output, logging the numbers. The engineers watch those numbers the way a pilot watches fuel state, because in a different sense, that is exactly what it is. So here is the question, and it is a real one with no clean answer. When a carrier commanding officer in the Gulf faces a sustained high-tempo period, the kind of sustained campaign that USS Dwight D. Eisenhower ran in 2024, and the distilling plant is running degraded, does it make more operational sense to cut the sortie rate, preserve the crew and systems, and accept a reduced contribution to theater missions? Or to hold the tempo, maintain the deterrent signal, and manage the wear on people and equipment through strict conservation and accelerated maintenance? Both choices are defensible. Both choices carry costs that the other choice avoids and the other choice creates. What is your read on that? The commanding officer who gets it right is the one whose ship arrives at the end of a 9-month deployment with the engineering plant still healthy, the crew still capable, and the air wing still flying. Getting there is not a single decision. It is the accumulation of every daily water report, every maintenance rotation call, every sortie count adjustment. The sum of engineering discipline applied against a constraint that the reactor's power cannot overcome and the carrier's weapons cannot solve. The most powerful warship in the world keeps a small team of engineers watching a pair of evaporators, and the fleet runs on what they produce. If you want to understand what comes next, how the Gerald R. Ford-class attempts to break the water catapult link with EELS, and what new constraints that system introduces, that is the next video. The engineering never stops.